So pray for his safe journey today. Also on the calendar of the church in the United States, we celebrate the memorial of St. Peter Claver. He is depicted in one of our saints' images, the last one, the furthest to my right, if I'm turning that way. He was a Spanish Jesuit in the 17th century, 1600s, from Majorca. Actually, it was an island in the Mediterranean off the coast of Spain. At the urging of the porter, or the guy who was the doorkeeper at a Jesuit community by the name of Alphonse Rodriguez, he urged him, if you really want to serve the Lord, go to the Americas. So he signed up to be a missionary and winds up in what's now modern-day Cartegena, where he was ordained. One of the things that is happening in Cartegena, that it is at that time, the largest place in which African slaves are entering into the Americas. One of the things we may not realize, far more Africans were made slaves in South America, particularly South America and the Caribbean, than were later in what's now the United States. Peter Claver's response to this was a bit creative, put it that way. He already found other Jesuits who were doing the same thing. Even though the slave trade had been condemned by the papacy repeatedly, as we look around our own day, just because a pope says something doesn't necessarily mean the lay faithful will take it to heart. A lot of Spanish colonists were making a lot of money off of the slaves, who then worked in mines. They worked on plantations. And so they enslaved human beings, treated them as property. And who knows how many died on that voyage from West Africa to the Americas. And when they did die on those ships, they were simply the bodies were thrown overboard, treated as livestock. No doubt many of those colonists who did so would have probably seen themselves as devout Catholics, not unlike today, to be in direct disobedience of what the church proclaims as true, but dignity of the human person, yet still self-label, put it that way, as a devout Catholic. Claver, what he would do when these big slave ships would arrive in the harbor, would go with some assistants and would often go on board and begin immediately to minister to the physical needs of the Africans. He saw beyond race. He saw beyond culture, beyond religion. Because these slaves that were coming, these people who were being enslaved, none of them were Christian. They had their own native deities, native religions. He saw past all of that. He saw them as those that had been made in the image and likeness of God and redeemed by Christ, whether they knew it or not. And he made a promise when he was first ordained to the priesthood, I will be a slave to the slaves. He first ministered to their physical needs, but then also they began to, as he also was learning the language, many different languages, began to catechize them. And he's one of these Jesuit missionaries that is credited with baptizing hundreds of thousands of people. Like Francis Xavier, I think his like 300,000 plus. I got a long way to go. I got a lot of catching up to do to get to kind of get in the top tier of those ranks. But Peter Claver, because in many ways embodies what we hear today for Paul's letters to the Colossians about how to love one another. And also we're hearing from Jesus, from his lips, basically Luke's version of the Beatitudes, about what it means to love, and to love your enemies, love those who are different from yourself. And not only would Peter Claver do this on the slave ships, he also kept track of the people that he had met, those he had baptized, and would follow, and actually would go and check on them, on whether they worked on plantations, they worked on different farms, they worked in mines. And he always made a point, instead of staying with his fellow Spaniards in the large home, he stayed in the slave quarters. his way of showing the dignity, the human dignity of the slaves. And by and large, his fellow Spaniards despised him, because by his example, he reflected back to them their sin, their error. The last few years of his life, he dies around the mid-70s. He was apparently pretty much an invalid, and the man was set in charge to take care of him often mistreated him. And when it was brought to, people, Peter Claver would simply say, "It's simply penance for my sins of what I'm enduring now." And as often might be the case, even though he was despised by his fellow Spaniards, when he dies, they give him one of the biggest funerals in Cartegena to that date, trying to make up for all that hatred. He was canonized in 1888 and is seen as a patron, particularly to black Catholics in the United States and elsewhere. He embodies the words of the scriptures that we hear. He embodied that love your enemies and not just those that are like you. And especially for us today, what a powerful witness in a culture that this obsession, and an unhealthy obsession with race, an obsession with all these different things that are being used to separate us from one another. To see beyond all of those things and to see that we are made in the image and likeness of God. We have an inherent dignity because we exist. That dignity is given to us by God, not bestowed upon us by any government, by any crown, by any parliament. I heard it once said by an evangelical minister. He said too often his fellow evangelicals, they get the equation backwards. They think that people are valuable because they have been saved, because they've been saved by the cross of Christ. He says, no, we need to reverse it. People are saved because they're valuable, because they've been made by God and made for a purpose and have that inherent human dignity. Now, I was listening to this years ago on the radio and be like, oh, wow, I wish I could call this guy up. Let's have let me introduce you to Thomas Aquinas, or some good Catholic moral theology and Catholic social teaching. We were called to see the inherent dignity that exists in every one of us. That's what Peter Claver gave himself over to in the name of Christ, because Christ loved the people, including the least of his brothers and sisters, and therefore he loved them as well. If there's intercession today, may we seek to do the same.